Well, Dave, it is great to be here with you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we are talking about found money, why smart investors never donate cash. I'm Daniel Blake. I'm the CEO of UI Charitable, and I'm here with my good friend Dave McClure. Dave, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Dave McClure. I'm a venture capitalist here in California, although I'm actually in New York at the moment. I have been an entrepreneur, engineer, worked at PayPal for a few years, worked at Founders Fund for a few years, was the founding partner of 500 startups and invested in literally thousands of companies all over the world. We were fortunate to invest in a bunch of really great companies, Canva, GitHub, GitLab, excuse me, Solana, and several others. I've spent a few years as a venture capitalist. Now we are focused on buying secondary at Practical Venture Capital. And I've been fortunate to have a few successes, and I've had some tax issues and some founder things that I've sort of really learned over the years. And I wanted to sort of pass on those lessons and help people save some money on taxes and also get started with some of their charitable giving.
Awesome. So I think a lot of people view this as a pretty niche topic, but I would argue this is applicable to far more people than the average person realizes. And so to help set this up, the question that Dave and we've been asking ourselves and saying, who is this relevant to? Is it, do you have a tender offer, a secondary sale, or an IPO coming up in the next 12 months? If you do, you better have a donor advised fund.
Well, I think there's probably a lot of people in the San Francisco Bay Area who may have that opportunity to make a big mistake this year. There's a lot of potential IPOs that are happening. There are a lot of secondaries that are happening. And I guess we're laughing a little bit here, but the opportunity is really to save quite a bit of money on your taxes by one pretty simple and straightforward opportunity, and that's to donate some of your illiquid asset positions, whether those are in companies or funds, into your own donor advised fund. And that might sound like you're giving it away, but what we're really saying is you're kind of giving it to yourself in exchange for an immediate tax deduction, and then you can still hold those assets in your philanthropic account, and hopefully they continue to grow and exit. And you can also get started with some of your charitable giving and manage those assets just like you would out of your for-profit pocket, but for future philanthropic efforts. But you don't have to wait until you get an exit to make that happen. And we're going to explain a little bit about how you can donate those illiquid positions and potentially save 6 or 7 figures right now.
And I think that's the point that most people don't realize. People may or may not be familiar with a donor advised fund. I don't think they realize how powerful a donor advised fund can be if you have illiquid assets. And if you're the average VC, the average founder, and if you're not using this strategy, you are probably leaving, like Dave mentioned, 500,000, maybe upwards of $2 million in tax savings on the table every year. And this really comes down to just the simple fact that selling privately held complex assets can be really, really difficult. The value at which you can sell those assets often differs, sometimes significantly, from the fair market value, and you're having to sell those assets at a really steep discount. And I think most people realize this. What people don't realize is how easy it can be to donate those privately held complex assets. It's going to increase your tax deduction. The portion that's donated into your donor advised fund, you avoid capital gains when you sell that position. And it allows you to increase your funding for your charitable goals. And so just, a very quick high level example or case study. Your GP, LP, you have your interest, fair market value at $1 million. What most people do, if they're wanting to get out of that position, is they're going to try to sell it in a secondary sale. That may or may not happen. You might be able to sell it. Who knows what the discount's going to be? If you do sell it, you are going to pay capital gains on it. In this example, let's say you sell that position, that has a fair market value of $1 million, you sell it for 300,000. The other option that you should be aware of, especially if you can't sell that position, is the ability that you can donate it to your donor advice fund. You get an immediate tax deduction at the fair market value, in this case, $1 million. If you do end up selling it, because you're selling it inside the structure of a donor advice fund, you're not paying capital gains on that. So just in this simple scenario here, you have, 300,000 to 500,000 in total tax savings, which depending on your tax bill for the year, is significant and is going to be worth, way more to you than just selling that secondary position for, in this case, 300,000. And Dave, you've done this a handful of times.
Done it a few times. Done it with both fund interests as well as company interests, and was able to book, in my case, over $5 million worth of tax credits, which hopefully I get to use this year if Canada goes public. We'll see if that happens. But and Dan's point, I think, is really important in that sometimes when you're trying to sell a complex asset, particularly if you're selling a fund interest, there may not be a ready buyer for that asset. And many times it may be a much lower price than the on paper value. In that particular scenario, where there's a big difference between the market price and the on paper value, or in some cases, as Dan mentioned, there's no price because there isn't a buyer. I will use this soundbite. The IRS is always your secondary buyer of last resort. And they may not pay full price, but they'll pay you at your marginal tax rate. And so if you happen to live in a high tax state like California or New York or Massachusetts, if you happen to be paying taxes at ordinary income levels, which might be close to 40%, you can save quite a bit in those asset contributions. You'll basically get the equivalent of your marginal tax rate back, which could be 30, 40, 50 cents on the dollar. And so that's real tax savings that you can book against the tax bill you have this year and potentially for up to 5 years.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. So we've made reference to donor advice funds a couple of times. So let's just quickly define what is a donor advice fund. Why is a donor advice fund a really powerful tool for you to consider? So in really simple terms, a donor advice fund is a charitable giving account, but it allows you to separate out the timing of your tax deduction from the timing of your charitable giving. And so by separating out those two decisions, you're now able to optimize for both of those decisions. And so when you donate to a donor advice fund, you become the donor advisor over that fund. You can make recommendations on how it's invested, on what charitable causes you support. But when you make that initial contribution into your donor advice fund, you receive an immediate tax deduction. So that allows you to time the tax deduction to when you have the greatest need for that tax deduction. Those assets can then sit in the donor advice fund and they grow tax-free. And then over time, when you've decided what you want to support from a charitable standpoint, you can then grant out of your donor advice fund to various nonprofit or social causes that you care about. Going back to the management of the donor advice fund, one of I think a really compelling use case is being able to use DAF assets to make startup investments, to do your angel investing. We see a lot of founders, we see a lot of investors, instead of doing their angel investing out of their normal pocket, doing it out of the corpus of the donor advised fund. And the thing that most people don't realize is how flexible some donor advice funds are. Not all donor advice funds are created equal, but it's important to call out. So yes, you can donate cash. You shouldn't, but you can. Yes, you can donate public securities, but you can also donate private company stock, GPLP interests, precious metals, cryptocurrency, real estate. There's a tremendous amount of flexibility in what you can donate into your donor advised fund. Because of that, everyone should be looking at their personal balance sheet and saying which asset makes the most sense for me to donate from a tax deduction standpoint. Anything that you'd want to call out there, Dave?
Well, I think I want to make sure that people know that they can't do that with every DAF. There's only a few DAF platforms that are as flexible as UI Charitable and allow you to donate those types of assets. So, although we're talking about donating illiquid assets to your DAF, I would say you probably want to talk to UI Charitable or other folks who do accept those illiquid assets. And more importantly, not just accept them, but allow you to hold them in their original form.
Oh, awesome. Thank you, Dave. So now, how does this apply to all of you? So let's look at donor advised funds specifically for founders and employees. Founders and employees are in generally a different wealth category than most other individuals, given that, generally you have illiquid wealth. And when you have a liquidity event, these events can be life-changing events for a founder or for an employee, but it creates a one-time tax planning opportunity. And if you're not careful about the order of operations in which you approach these liquidity events, you can lock in really big tax bills. But if you're thoughtful about this process and prior to a liquidity event, you look at donating a portion of your illiquid wealth in kind to your donor advice fund, again, you get your immediate tax deduction at the fair market value, and you avoid capital gains. But this planning is not possible after the fact. After that liquidity event, your ordinary income, the capital gains, it's irreversible. You now owe taxes, and that's, in some cases is going to be a really significant tax bill.
I think Daniel's point here is well taken, although when he's saying there's a one-time tax planning opportunity, what I think he's really saying is there's a time that you might make a really big and dumb mistake. And so try and avoid that. And the really basic step is, hey, I'm going to participate in this tender or this secondary sale, or I know there's an IPO or an exit coming up. I want to set aside a portion of the shares that I would normally sell and get cash for, and contribute those to my DAF to offset the taxes that I'm going to have to pay for. So that, not really that complicated, but just in advance tax planning should be like, okay, I would normally pay this much in taxes. Do I have that money sitting around or not? Now think about just donating enough to offset or cover that tax bill.
And what's really important about what Dave is saying is it's not either or, it should be a combination of both. You should participate in the tender, in the secondary sale. And in addition to doing that, and prior to doing that, also donate to a donor advised fund to offset that upcoming tax burden. And so again, we walked through this earlier, but if you have private security, whatever the fair market value is, sell a portion of it, absolutely, but also donate a portion of it. The portion that's donated, you're going to avoid capital gains on that. You receive the immediate tax deduction based on the fair market value. And then because it's in your donor advised fund, you can decide, do you want to continue holding that asset? Do you want to sell it? And when and where would you want to donate those assets to various different charitable causes? What most people do is they sell, everything. They're taxed on it. They then have cash. They then donate that cash to charity. And that is the absolute worst thing that you can do from a tax efficiency standpoint.
Yeah, and I think the point there is that you don't necessarily have to not sell once you donate to your DAF. You could just do the sale within the DAF, and then you don't pay any taxes on the portion you sell in the DAF. And you can use those cash proceeds to start doing charitable giving or impact. But you don't have to sell once you put it in the DAF.
Absolutely. And again, it's a much simpler process than most people realize. So you donate your non-public shares in kind to the donor advice fund. And again, it's really important that it's in kind. And then you decide, do you want to hold or do you want to sell inside of the DAF? If you do sell, you now have liquidity to either reinvest those funds, whether it's as an angel investor, whether it's in public markets, or using that liquidity again to support various different charitable causes that you care about. And so it's a really interesting, again, use case for founders and employees that have a really high degree of illiquid wealth and have an upcoming liquidity event. There's another really interesting use case, which would be using a donor advised fund if you are a GP or an LP. And again, this goes back to what Dave and I talked about at the beginning. When private assets are donated, the IRS uses the fair market value as determined by a third-party appraisal to determine what the tax deduction is valued at. They don't use the sales price. And so that means your tax deduction might be significantly different than what you can sell that asset for. And so again, assets valued at fair market value, the value after the donation might rise or fall, but the deduction is locked in at the time of donation. So Dave, not to, hit on this from too many different angles, but why do you think this matters so much if you are a GP or an LP?
Well, it matters a lot because the value that is assessed may not be the value in the future. And let's just say that there probably are a lot of assets out there that were priced in the 2021 ZERP era that may not actually fetch that same value at market if you were to sell those assets. But it might be reasonably appraised at that value if it's held on paper by the fund or by the company that's reporting that number to you. And so if you were to say want to donate that, you would go to a third party accounting firm and say, here's the value that's been reported by the company or by the VC fund. They would use that as the initial anchor position to begin their diligence and value the asset. In many cases, they might value at close to that value on paper or even 100% of that value on paper. And then you can maximize the value of your tax deduction, regardless of what that value might be in the future. And so Dan's comment about locking in that value for your tax deduction at the time of assessment is really, really important. Heaven forbid that asset might not be worth that amount in the future, could even fall to zero. You've now locked in your tax savings at a substantial amount of money, much higher than what you could fetch for that if you tried to sell it on the market or were unable to sell it on the market.
And I think it's interesting looking at why it could be difficult to sell the position in the market. Recently we've been working with a handful of LPs that just candidly have pretty small positions. So, it might be, compelling underlying assets that they have, but their overall position is just so small. It's difficult to go find a secondary buyer for the size of position that they have. So regardless of, and this is another thing that sets UI Charitable and our donor advice fund apart, is we have no minimums. So, Silicon Valley Community Foundation, it's very sophisticated. They will accept all of this, but they have really high minimums. And so regardless of your overall position, it's really important to recognize that the IRS does allow you to donate it. You can donate it to a donor advice fund, at an organization like UI Charitable, and book those tax savings. And again, you have the option to hold or sell. If you sell within a donor advised fund structure, you avoid capital gains. And that significantly increases what's available for charitable giving.
Again, I just want to point this out. If you have SpaceX in your portfolio, if you have Anthropic, if you have OpenAI, those assets are highly valuable. They're recently priced. They're in a lot of demand. Those probably aren't the things that you're necessarily going to be selling right away or donating, but that's a very high class asset. If you have any other set of companies that aren't the most famous, the most visible, the most highly valuable and growing, you're probably not going to have as easy a time trying to sell those assets in the market, particularly if they're in a fund where you have a basket of assets, particularly if it's a smaller value position where there might not be easy to find a buyer. In many of those cases, you will either face a very substantial discount in the on-paper value, or you'll have no buyer whatsoever. And these are the scenarios where the value that you can donate at is substantially higher. than the value you can get in the market, and thus your tax savings are dramatically higher as well.
A couple of details to be aware of, and this will help, create a framework as to how to think about how much you should donate. So again, you can donate essentially any type of asset as long as it can be valued by a third party to determine what the fair market value is. And then the deduction is restricted to 30% of your AGI. If you exceed that amount, the excess tax deduction can be rolled forward for up to 5 years. So one way of looking at this is saying, what do I think my tax burden is going to be over a 5-year period? And do I have assets that have either are, very highly appreciated or that perhaps are overvalued? Those are kind of the two categories of assets that I would recommend people consider donating. You should then donate that asset, perhaps exceeding that 30% AGI limit in year one, but allowing that to roll forward for the next 5 years. It is important to recognize this is really only applicable to those that have a US tax burden. Other countries have vehicles similar to donor advised funds, but you do want to make sure you understand that given wherever your tax nexus is. And then in the case of fund interest, generally speaking, the GP is always going to have to sign off on any transfer. And so, as you are looking at which assets would be appropriate to donate to a donor advised fund, it needs to be something where you have a high degree of confidence that the GP or the management is going to consent to the transfer. I will say we've done hundreds of these, and I don't know if I can think of any scenarios where we haven't been able to get the GP or management consent. So, any reasonable person should be willing to sign off on this, but it is important to call out that donations like this are subject to GP or management consent.
Just one note there about the math that Daniel was pointing out. So if you can think about sort of what your likely income and investment gains are going to be over the next 5 years, add those up, multiply that by 30%, and that's your bogey to go after in terms of the amount of donation to offset any taxes you would have to pay. So that's, a pretty big opportunity for people that haven't been thinking about it. Again, if you've got illiquid assets sitting around, whether that's real estate, business interests, startup stock, VC funds, there's a whole bunch of things that might be considered there. Crypto assets, where you can donate those assets to offset future taxes.
And again, super simple process. Select the asset. Again, what assets are highly appreciated on your balance sheet, or what assets do you feel like are perhaps overvalued? There's some due diligence that you're going to want to look at. Specifically, will the GP or management consent to a gift? We will help you put together that gift agreement. We can help you go get a third-party appraisal. And then as soon as that asset is transferred, again, you receive an immediate tax deduction. Dave mentioned cryptocurrency. One of the things that we've noticed is many GPs, many LPs, many tech founders and employees also have exposure to cryptocurrency. You can donate cryptocurrency. It eliminates any taxable events. Again, you eliminate capital gains. We accept Bitcoin, Ethereum, and just over 5,000 other cryptocurrencies. And our crypto structure within our donor advice fund is going to be more sophisticated than the typical donor advice fund. We hold all of the cryptocurrency in a hardware or multi-sig wallet, and we allowed you to hold as long as you would like. Dave, you're on mute, but it looks like you have some comments there.
Sorry, I was going to say you don't hold it, you hodl it.
Absolutely.
But
our donor advice fund is currently the only donor advice fund where you can donate crypto in kind, hold it in kind, and then also grant it out in kind to organizations that you want to support. So everything can be done on chain. Again, very simple process. Identify what tokens you want to donate it to your donor advised fund. You receive the tax deduction, and then you decide, do you want to hold? Do you want to liquidate? And when and where would you like to donate to support your preferred charitable cause? Dave mentioned at the beginning, not all donor advised funds are created equal. It's important to call out that the IRS allows for everything that we just talked about, and it is all very well documented. But many donor advised funds have just placed internal constraints as to what they will and will not accept. So at UI Charitable, we think it's really important that donors are afforded all of the flexibility that's given to them by the IRS. So if the IRS permits it, we do everything that we can to enable you to take advantage of those solutions. So we have no minimums. We'll accept any type of asset that can be appraised by a third party. And again, the IRS process for donating these complex assets is well documented. We have a long history of dealing with these assets. Quick comparison, most people are going to be familiar with the donor advised fund because of Fidelity Charitable or Schwab Charitable. They recently rebranded to DAF Giving 360. All three organizations will accept private stock. Fidelity and Schwab are going to have greater constraints, greater limitations as to the type of private stock that they will accept. Same thing with GP and LP interests. The biggest difference is they're going to force you to liquidate that position when it's been donated. A lot of people want to continue holding those positions. Where we start to differ significantly from Fidelity and Schwab Charitable is the fact that we allow you to continue to invest in private securities. So if you want exposure to real estate, private equity, venture, again, I think doing your angel investing out of a donor advised fund is a really interesting use case. So the ability to hold those illiquid assets or to invest in illiquid positions post donation is really unique to UI Charitable. And again, us accepting crypto and allowing you to hold it. And I will call out that the fees for all three groups are essentially identical. And so it's the same price, but far more flexibility. Dave, you've worked with us for the last, 4 or 5 years now, maybe.
Over 5 years. And you mentioned that some people do their investing out of their donor advised fund. I've done that. I've invested over $2 or $3 million in both startups and funds. I guess for a lot of people who do startup investing and VC fund investing, you might want to think about it as charitable giving because sometimes it doesn't come back. But it certainly usually takes a very long time. And I decided about 4 or 5 years ago to shift most of my investing, at least personal investing that goes into startups and fund managers, out of my donor advised fund account. And so kind of the same thing I've been doing over the last 15 years, but now I can do it out of my philanthropic account. And, frankly, I don't worry as much about whether that's coming back right away or not.
Awesome. So a couple of case studies giving you more context, a few examples to help spark, different ideas so that you all can see, is this relevant to me and my situation? So this first one is work that we did with a former executive at a social media company. So this was pre-IPO. The individual decided that they wanted to diversify their position. And so they were selling some of their employee stock prior to the IPO. In conjunction with that sale, they decided to donate $5 million worth of their stock into their donor advised fund. So they did that. They received a tax deduction for $5 million that helped offset the sale that they went through. They also decided to sell the stock inside of the donor advised fund. Given the quality of this company, the fact that it was in high demand, they sold it tax-free. They didn't pay capital gains on it. And they also sold it at a 0% discount. And so they then had $5 million cash go back into their donor advised fund. They were then able to use this $5 million to support all sorts of charitable activities that this individual cared deeply about. So that's one example.
And you should mention, Daniel, that as a result of that, they avoided over $2 million in taxes.
Absolutely. Again, these tax savings, there are very few things that you can do that will generate the tax savings that we're talking about. This next one is a little bit more complicated, perhaps a little bit more creative. And to illustrate this case study, we've created these two tracks. So what actually happened was here in the green. So a startup founder of a tech startup, they'd recently raised around at an $800 million valuation. He decided to donate $1 million of shares to his donor advice fund, again, receiving an immediate tax deduction. He then took those shares and invested it in another fund. He said, this is an interesting way for diversification. I like what this fund is doing. And any growth of that fund is going to grow tax-free. If he had done this not in a donor advised fund, he would have sold those shares for $1 million. He would have paid 371 in taxes. When you look at federal taxes, California state taxes, meaning that after tax he would have only had $629,000 available to invest in this same fund. And so the outcome's the same. You can invest in this fund either way, but by doing it through a donor advice fund, his investments $370,000 greater than it would have been otherwise. The growth of the fund happens tax-free in the donor advice fund, whereas any growth outside of the donor advice fund is going to be taxed. And Dave, I should mention this fund that this individual invested in, if I'm not mistaken, was PBC Fund 3.
I was gonna, wonder if that was the case, but I believe I recognize this case study. So we were able to get that founder to swap in those assets and give them a diversified position. The company's one that we had already been looking at investing in, so for us that was kind of a double win. We were able to get a new LP, and we were able to invest in a company that we think is doing well and growing. And for the person in question, they were able to save almost $400,000 in taxes. That's quite substantial, and their donor advised fund had 50% more asset value to do in the future for charitable giving.
And there's a great question from Asher. So he asks, the tax-free increase in value is still part of the DAF, so not an increase in net worth or asset value. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So once funds are in a donor advised fund, you can't pull them out for your own personal benefit. You can continue to invest them, you can grow those assets, you can use those assets to support charitable causes that you care about. That might be the local Boys and Girls Club, local, kind of pick any charitable organization that you might care about here in the United States or internationally. So there is a lot of flexibility with what you can do from a charitable standpoint, but Asher is absolutely correct in that you can't pull out any of that increase for your own personal benefit. So that was everything that Dave and I had planned to go through today. We're happy to answer any questions that any of you have. Either if you have easy questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, feel free to reach out either to myself or Dave to talk about your individual situation. If you have specific questions, or if you just want to better understand Dave's experience having gone through this process multiple times himself.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize enough how material this is to both your bank account and to any charitable sources that you want to give money to. Also, just for your ability to grow your philanthropic account and get started with that process. Most people, wait until they actually have the cash to donate it, and you don't have to wait. Those companies and investments that you have are valuable on paper. You can save money on your taxes right away. You can book tax credits for the future. You can set up a DAF very easily with UI Charitable in less than 24 hours, and you can get started making change in the world happen. And that change happens in your own bank account and pocketbook first.
That's a fantastic summary. Thank you, Dave.
Well, thanks for having me, and hopefully we pass the message on to a lot of other folks who can save some money on taxes and get started with their own charitable giving.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Dave. It's always a lot of fun.
Have a great afternoon.